Metro Milwaukee has a segregation problem, not least within area schools. Some say it's as bad today as it was 60 years ago at the height of the civil rights era. How did we get here? Let's take a look back. Many people remember May 17, 1954, the day the U.S. Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. The court's ruling upheld equal opportunity and outlawed school segregation policies around the country. Milwaukee was among several American cities that operated a segregated school system at the time, but it took several years before MPS was forced to do anything about it. That's because what had been happening in Milwaukee is called de facto segregation, which means segregation by fact. In contrast to de jure segregation, or segregation by law, Milwaukee students weren't being kept in separate schools by legal requirement. MPS based school assignment on neighborhood boundaries. Because of migration patterns in the 1800s, African Americans lived concentrated in a few distinct neighborhoods, which resulted in schools that were either predominantly black or predominantly white. So Milwaukee wasn't technically breaking the law, and MPS didn't really take any steps to desegregate schools following Brown v. Board. Instead, they spent their time dealing with things such as curriculum, budgets, and discipline. Meanwhile, activists outside the district started to make noise because things weren't changing, beginning with Lloyd Barbie. The NAACP member moved to Milwaukee in September 1962. He started rallying troops behind the cause of desegregation. He demanded MPS's governing body, the Milwaukee School Board, do something to reverse the trend. Barbie and his fellow activists promised a school boycott, pulling kids out of class, unless the board put integration plans in place by January 1964. Guess what? That didn't happen. So, activists figured there was power in numbers. They formed a group called MUSIC, the Milwaukee United School Integration Committee. Their chairperson, none other than Lloyd Barbie. Their first big event, that boycott they promised, in May 1964. Almost 12,000 MPS students participated. They skipped regular school, instead attending classes at one of 30 freedom schools, opened in local African American churches across the city. MUSIC would stage several more boycotts over the next few years, but none as well attended as the first. But MPS still didn't budge. People who opposed integration petitioned the Milwaukee School Board to uphold and support the neighborhood school system as it exists under law. Frustrated by the lack of change, Lloyd Barbie filed a suit against the school board in 1965. The case lingered for 11 years, until 1976, when federal courts ruled against MPS. Historian Reggie Jackson.
It was mandated by the U.S. Supreme Court in this 1976 decision that Milwaukee schools are segregated and that the Milwaukee Board of School Directors should come up with a plan to fix the problem.
The plan Milwaukee came up with? 2 words: magnet schools. The idea was that every MPS school would offer specialized curricula. For instance, South Division was designated to teach tourism and recreation. Agribusiness became the focus at Vincent High School, visual and performing arts in Bayview. And programs would attract the students interested in those subjects, no matter where they lived. The district began phasing in magnet programs in area high schools in 1976. The hope was that every building be magnetized within 2 years. But things didn't go as planned. Students didn't volunteer for the magnets in expected numbers. Many families didn't want to haul all the way across town. They preferred to stay in their neighborhoods. MPS administration tried to intervene, instituting tactics like entrance exams to area schools and mandated busing.
There really weren't mechanisms in place that the Milwaukee School Board could force people to have their children go to these schools.
So, Reggie Jackson says, white families left Milwaukee in droves.
For the most part, whites in the city, as well as in suburban communities, said, you know, well, we don't want black children in schools with our children. So what they started to do was they started to pull their sons and daughters out of schools in the city of Milwaukee. And so you went from having a very large number of white students in the 70s, and that number began to drop, and it dropped precipitously.
Wisconsin also tried to encourage voluntary integration between city and suburban districts through a program called Chapter 220. It was pretty involved. Look for a sidebar with more information on our website. The burden of busing in the late 1970s fell largely on black kids, and a man named Howard Fuller began pointing out the inequity. Fuller, an MPS alum, rose to prominence in Milwaukee's black community in the late 1970s. He advocated for community control of schools and voiced concerns about what he called the discriminatory implementation of desegregation in Milwaukee.
The way that integration was implemented in Milwaukee was done for the benefit of white people.
Fuller's ideas gained traction, so much so that he rose to the top of MPS. The board named Fuller superintendent in 1991. Also in 1991, Milwaukee opened its parental choice program, allowing distribution of vouchers to low-income students. And business interests began pushing for the expansion of charter schools. New schools started popping up in and around Milwaukee, offering alternative options to families, and pitting them in direct competition with MPS for students. Howard Fuller pushed for school choice.
In some ways, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program improved integration in Milwaukee in a certain sense because there were black children who went to private schools that were predominantly white. It is true that they created a number of one-race schools, but one-race schools also exist within the Milwaukee public school system.
Families' options expanded even wider when the state of Wisconsin began open enrollment in 1997. It allowed students to transfer to a different public school district. The year MPS joined the program, the district lost 370 students. 269 of them were white. Enrollments in MPS, specifically white enrollments, have been dropping ever since. Researcher Mark Levine.
After a somewhat promising period in the 1980s, actually, of a seeming diminution of segregation in schools. After the early 1990s, we see a resegregation of Milwaukee's schools, so that today Metro Milwaukee has the highest rate of black students attending 90% minority schools of any metro area in the country, slightly higher than Detroit and Chicago and New York.
Today, half of MPS students are black, 13% are white, and more than 80% of district families are considered economically disadvantaged.